This is one of the most interesting shotguns in the world. It has 2 triggers, 2 magazine tubes, and a mechanical computer responsible for controlling its feeding. Roughly 20 examples are thought to exist, all made between 1946 and 1948. It's a mechanical work of art, a true holy grail of shotguns. And the best part? It actually works. Today we'll be looking at a shotgun that is the first in a series of shotguns that is best known as the Breda Automatic. This series spanned from 1946, its inception with this model, through the 1990s, with a number of variants, the 1001, the 1036, the 1064, the 1008, the 1009, and many other names that the different models were known as. None of them, though, are quite as interesting and mechanically fascinating as the example we have here. In future videos, we'll be taking a look at those other models, seeing how this design, this mechanically amazing beast, ended up evolving into what is, in my opinion, the greatest automatic shotgun ever made. However, in today's video, we're going to focus on this, the mechanical mousetrap masterpiece that was Goffredo Prola's crowning achievement just before his death. Let's get stuck in for a look at the history, disassembly, mechanics, function, and shooting of what I firmly believe is the coolest shotgun ever made.
This is the Breda Prola, everybody's favorite 2-trigger, 2-magazine automatic shotgun. This shotgun sought to solve the problem of what if you want 2 different kinds of shells in your gun when you're hunting. Say you want larger shot and smaller shot, higher velocity and maybe lower velocity for closer targets. Loading the front magazine is accomplished like we're used to with shotguns, where we put 1 round in the chamber and then shove 2 rounds forward into the tube. Loading the rear magazine is accomplished by pushing shells backwards and depressing this extra latch to enable the shells to be retained in that magazine. At this point, we have 5 rounds loaded up. Now, the way this gun's mechanism works, pulling the rear trigger will pull around from the rear magazine, pulling the front trigger will pull around from the front magazine. If the front magazine ever runs empty, the front trigger will start feeding from the rear magazine, but the rear trigger will only ever pull from the rear magazine. To demonstrate this, we'll start by firing with the rear trigger. We can see we currently have a red shell in there. Pulling the rear trigger will get us an orange shell. At this point, we have an orange shell loaded. If we pulled the front trigger again, we'd get another red shell. Just like that, we have a red shell. If we were to pull the front trigger again, 1 more red shell. At this point, the gun is out of red shells. If we pull the front trigger or the rear trigger, we'll get an orange shell either way. But off of the front trigger here, we now have an orange shell chambered. Firing this shell would then make the gun empty, but if we take 1 red shell to put in the front magazine and another orange shell to put in the rear magazine, We'll be able to see that by pulling the rear trigger, we cannot get the front magazine to feed. This is designed so that the rear magazine is always isolated to that rear trigger, so you'd sort of put the rounds you don't want to be firing unless they're at your specific desired target in the rear magazine, and then your general purpose rounds in the front. But if we do the rear trigger 2 more times, we'll load that orange shell, eject that orange shell, but now we still have our red shell there in the front. If we wanted to make it able to feed, we'd have to manually extract it from the magazine. Unloading the front magazine is like so, then throw it into the chamber. Or with the gun locked open, we could have just put an extra shell in there. At this point, either trigger will fire and lock the gun open.
Now, history on the Breda Prola can be very difficult to come by. I have spent many, many hours researching the thing to try and better understand where it came from and why it ended up not really being very popular. Now, as we go through the mechanics, we'll probably be able to see why the popularity was a little bit of an issue for it. However, to understand its history, we go back to about 1935, where a guy living in Italy, specifically from Rome, named Goffredo Prola, had come up with a shotgun which had 2 magazine tubes. One magazine tube in the front and one in the back, and a pair of triggers. He'd spend the next 5 years refining and perfecting the design to the point that he had a prototype that is generally just called the Prola. Now, of course, World War II happened. Italy was very involved in it, and by the end of the war, production of civilian and sporting things had pretty much ceased. But there, in 1946, production of those sporting things was able to begin again. Now, Mr. Prola had taken his shotgun design to Breda, and Breda Meccancia Brescia at this point, as the B&B factory. They had been demilitarized and were able to make things like motorcycles or civilian sporting arms. They made toasters and convection ovens and all sorts of things, but couldn't make military equipment anymore as a term of Italy's surrender during the war. And one of the things that they began looking at was, of course, as I mentioned, civilian sporting arms. Now, Prola brought with him his prototype, and that began the design and development of a gun that would be known as the Breda Prola. And it seems about the span of the year, they went from the Prola prototype, which will point out the differences to this gun. There are quite a few differences, although the way they work is still pretty much the same. You've got 2 triggers, 2 magazine tubes. Pulling one or the other trigger draws from one or the other magazine to sort of affect which round is going to be loaded into the gun next. However, the design was simplified quite a bit to become the Breda Prola that we have today. Examples of Prola prototypes, seems like there's maybe only 1 or 2 of them out there. The Breda Prola guns, it seems like there's maybe between 20 and 30 of them. Now, these guns would never actually be manufactured in large numbers, mostly because Prola died right as the gun was getting into production, and there was some sort of a dispute about the patent rights. I'm not entirely sure what this was, but it seems like there was a provisional agreement in place for the development of the gun, but there was never a full assignment of rights to allow Breda to put the gun into manufacture and start selling it. And because the patent rights then reverted to Prola's family, there was some sort of a fallout between the company and the family that resulted in this gun never really seeing heavy production. Now, as I understand it, there was a plan for this gun to be in heavy production and maybe have been like a competitor to the Cosmi, a bespoke, lots of hand fit, lots of man hours go into the gun, and it's mechanically interesting in a way that at least offers you some utility, some arguable utility, I'd say, in the case of this. Whereas the utility in the Cosmi, I think, is easier to understand by the time you've shot it. Understanding the utility in this is very dependent on your circumstances and your experience. But that all said, there was a fallout. The design of the gun then sort of fell into obscurity. Breda would have registered between 20 and 30 of them with the Italian government by 1958, and then finally by the 1980s, as Breda was sort of starting to step out of the small arms manufacture game, they would give the guns away as sort of like a to executives in the company as like a congratulations for your service with the company, or they'd be gifted as gifts to sort of dignitaries or political figures. But most of the guns left the Breda factory around this time frame, and the examples that you'll find typically are very difficult to come by. I've actually had the opportunity to handle 2 different examples. One that was in pristine, completely unmolested condition. I don't know that it had been fired much at all. We did at least fire it a little bit to verify that it didn't work. It seems like these guns required quite a bit of intricate hand fitting in order to get the magazine system to be running completely reliably. This example here has quite a few rounds on it. We'll point out the wear as we go through it, but it's seen quite a storied life. It's been restocked. I think this handguard is also a replacement. Most of the pieces in this gun still match in terms of the assembly number on them. However, there's been very obvious filing and grinding on some of these parts in order to get the gun to work correctly. However, this is an example of a Breda Prola that is 100% working reliably. It draws from whichever magazine you pull. I've probably put 150, 200 rounds through the thing at this point. flawless. It has worked exactly as it is supposed to for every single trigger pull, which is really amazing for, as we'll see once we get inside of here, how incredibly complex the gun is. I will preface, in this video we will not be full detail stripping it just because that takes too much time. We will have a time-lapse towards the end of the video where we have one fully disassembled that gets put back together, because that's certainly interesting to see, and we did get footage of that. I had to take this one apart in order to detail clean it because, as I'd mentioned, it had a lot of rounds through it. So I got it cleaned up, got it all back together. And while I got the reassembly filmed, the disassembly was not on camera. So maybe at some point in the future I can handle that. But the interesting thing, right, the one comment I'll say before taking the gun at least part way apart so we can see its mechanics a little better, is that assembling this thing and disassembling this thing is actually pretty easy in the grand scheme of things. There's a lot of springs and a lot of levers and a lot of parts that have to fit together in a particular order. But besides that complexity, the thing is actually really, really shockingly well designed. And you may be looking at all of the internals and going, how on earth did they ever think that would be marketable? I think it's because they understood this gun actually isn't that hard to maintain and take care of, because it is really well designed for the task it's doing. Of course, effectively what you're doing is putting a mechanical computer in the gun, where your input here gives you an output here. The added complexity is the rear trigger is only connected to the rear magazine, the front trigger is connected to the front magazine until the front magazine is empty, and then the front trigger is connected to the rear magazine. It's a real cool system. We'll dive inside and see exactly how that looks. But just to wrap up the history, the whole time this gun was in development there, 1946 sort of the 1948 time frame by the time Breda was done with them, Breda was also working on a shotgun known as the 1001. We'll look at the 1001 and then the later Breda Automatic in a separate video, but the 1001 and the Breda Automatic were effectively this gun, but in a conventional format. Of course, skinnied up, a little bit more conventional. Its manufacturing approach didn't have the rear magazine, just had a magazine there on the front. And that's sort of the shotgun that we're more familiar with today. So we'll go ahead and begin taking this apart. Disassembly of the front end is more or less just like we're used to with any of these sort of things. We will lock our bolt back. And then we have a ring. Of course, it is a reduced diameter ring because this thing does not have a typical end cap. It's actually just got a screw out here at the end of the barrel. Take that screw off. Take our handguard off. The handguard is metal reinforced on the end. We'll talk more about the handguard here in a second. One problem that I would say that this gun has is that the friction ring system is not entirely retained on the magazine tube. This is because this particular shotgun, right, all of these, had a 2-round front tube and a 2-round back tube, plus one in the chamber for a 5-round total capacity. I'm not sure why they wouldn't have done a longer tube here or a longer tube here. There's certainly the real estate, totally could have been done. It seems like they were just trying to not make the gun too heavy whenever fully loaded, because there weren't hunting laws in Italy that required a certain round capacity at the time this was made. So there was certainly a little bit of confusion on my end trying to figure out why they had set the gun up this way, but I think it just had to do with balance and overall weight, that they wanted to keep it from being way too heavy whenever it was loaded. But we can see our friction ring system here, just like with the, this is, right, at the end of the day, a Breda Automatic, and so we have our flat washer, our control ring, our friction ring. Set those to the side there. We have our barrel spring. Nothing really new there, right? That's the typical Browning style friction system. Here on our handguard, right, we've got this little snoot out here on the front of the magazine. That snoot sits inside of here, and then the screw, of course, cinches up to it. The handguard is a metal reinforcement plate here. Instead of the barrel just bottoming out on the front of the handguard like you'd see on a lot of the Brownings, the barrel simultaneously bottoms out on the steel plate and the handguard. I imagine the way that they had this set up at the factory is that it bottomed out first on the wood, and then after that wood just took a little bit of compression, it bottoms out on both, sort of to share the load. The reason I suspect this is a replacement handguard, though, is it's got a number, and that number doesn't match the assembly number of the gun, and a little bit of a crack formed here on the handguard as a result of having shot it. Certainly unfortunate. The crack is repaired, and that repair is now holding quite well. But the barrel itself was actually pushing on the sides of the handguard pretty hard and ended up being the reason that crack showed up. There's also another small hairline crack here coming from the screw hole. This metal plate is held on by 3 screws. Very minor crack there, but all that to say, I think this is a replacement handguard anyway, and I think it's certainly already been beat on. It's got quite a bit of wear. You can see where the barrel's been bottoming out against it. Certainly not a sort of new condition or new configuration part by any means. Now, one interesting thing to note here is that the magazine tube is actually just freely threaded into the receiver. You can thread it right back out. It has a timing mark on top of it to get it clocked back into the gun correctly, but otherwise this is sort of just the way the handguard, the way the system works. The threads are cut precise enough. There really isn't any wobble of the magazine tube. I know we've talked before, wobble in the magazine tube because the friction system is there can be really bad. However, because of the way that these threads are cut, there really isn't any wobble to speak of, so that's very well designed. At this point, we can release the bolt slowly forward and slide our top cover off. Like the later Breda Automatics, this has a top cover sort of held on by slots onto the receiver. You have a couple of extra features here on this handguard that sort of interface, you have extra features here on this top cover that interface with the features on the handguard. Sort of the pins on the handguard sit into these holes, probably just to try and make it so everything fits together with a minimum amount of wiggle, so you don't have any wiggle on the top cover, you don't have any wiggle on the handguard. Makes everything fit extra snug, having all the parts interlocked together. Ultimately, we ended up be dropping from the later Breda Automatics. Now, of very interesting note, this top cover is fully machined. You can see inside of there, you might figure this to be a stamping, but the tool marks on the inside would tell you that's not what happened here. A ball-nosed end mill went and chased this whole mess out. Certainly a very, very impressive manufacturing job here to make something that's so thin, but so much material machined out. That said, if we look at an Auto 5, right, an Auto 5's receiver is also about as thin at the top and has all of its guts machined out, so it's certainly not unprecedented, but it's still pretty amazing to see that approach taken, because metal stamping was certainly in its infancy, especially as it comes to Italy. Italy hadn't really caught on to much of that during World War II and was still sticking to a lot of solid machined parts. Put those parts aside. The bolt carrier simply comes out the front of the gun, and it's a very different design than we're used to seeing because, as we'll get to later, we've got a magazine tube where we would normally have our action spring and bolt carrier tail. So our bolt carrier recoil assembly is made up of a pair of springs. It's got a guide rod in the middle, and then a guide rod on the very end. And this makes up the recoil spring assembly for the bolt. Not a whole lot to say there, besides it's interesting. It provides plenty of spring force. It works well. We have, I guess, a center support for the bolt group at this point. Of course, because we have a magazine from the bottom, right, in order for this to be hammer fired, the hammer has to hit a firing pin that's cut at an angle. The firing pin sort of sits at this angle to get to the front of the bolt face. Whenever the bolt lock comes up, we are able to get the firing pin to protrude through the bolt face. So that's how the bolt grip works. We won't detail strip this again. It's not actually very hard to detail strip. It's just a couple of pins to get it apart. But we have our latch here. We're used to seeing the locking block latch on the bottom on an Auto 5 anyway. For here, we have it on the side of the bolt. And that just raises a square lug locking block bit up. Very similar, right? Very Auto 5 inspired things going on here, with the exception of we've got a side firing pin. On the Prola prototypes, they actually had a striker fired system, sort of riding on this center pin. It would be held back and then released forward. Moving to hammer fire, I think, makes more sense, especially because of, once we see inside the trigger group, hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense to you guys. Inside of the guts of this gun, it's a benefit to have a hammer fired system, at least because your triggers are going to be in there interacting on a sear mechanism anyway, in order for the gun to know which trigger has been pulled, right? Because that mechanical computer system again. And because of that, I think having a hammer fired system isn't really a drawback in any meaningful way, because you've got the complexity that you'd be saving already present in the gun anyway. Now, at this point, what we've got to do is pop the stock off. The stock on these is reportedly extremely fragile. This is certainly a replacement stock compared to the other example I looked at. Its stock was much thinner, both in feel and in, just looking at it, you could tell it was thinner, and then in the hand, it's quite a bit thinner. But we will go ahead and remove the stock here so that we can get a better look at our rear magazine assembly. Butt pad's off there. Then we have our butt pad. Our butt pad features whatever the Roman goddess equivalent of Artemis is, with a hunting dog. They've got a bow and they shot a bird with a bow. This is probably quite a bit easier than using birds and bows, all things considered. With the stock screw undone, the stock can now pull off. And we have a couple of things to look at here. First off, our stock has relatively thin walls there and there, so we're going to be very careful with that. It is thicker here at the bottom than we're used to seeing with things like the Cosmi. Of course, Cosmi stocks are all very excited to crack down here where they get very thin. The Prola having some added thickness here is certainly nice, but I am going to set this stock over here off camera to avoid getting any bumps or dings in it, because that is probably the weakest part of the gun. If it isn't the weakest part of the gun, it's going to be this tang on the bottom of the receiver. This tang is not removable, and it's just sitting there waiting to be bent on accident. It is a thin piece of steel. It's welded on right here. You can see that this one's been bent and unbent a couple of times before, so we will be very, very careful to try and avoid causing any more bends or more damage to this bottom tang here on the receiver. We'll set the receiver down there, and we'll get our punch set. Get an appropriate punch to knock these 3 pins out. Probably need these 2 punches. That pin comes right out on its own, no need to hammer. And these are the pins that are going to be holding the rear magazine in. And they don't, of course, need to be terribly tight because they're really just trying to keep the magazine from coming out of the gun completely on its own. And with that pin drifted, we'll use the smaller punch to get it out because we don't want our punch to get stuck. There's our second pin, or third pin rather. Now, with those pins removed, the magazine's ready to come out, but it is a Tetris game to actually completely get it out of the receiver. So what we are going to do first is carefully lower the hammer, because I've found it a little bit easier to get the magazine out whenever the hammer is forward. And what we will need to do is push up on a little lip, a little stamped lip edge the magazine has that latches onto the receiver, sort of like a claw. We will need to boop that just slightly to start the magazine moving backwards, just like that. The magazine's already starting to move. Now, as the magazine moves backwards, the things we need to watch out for are this arm on the magazine that locks into this side pocket wants to get bent. The bottom tongue on the magazine, you sort of have to keep it from scraping along the bottom of the receiver, or it will get caught on the triggers behind it. Additionally, as we're getting it out, we sometimes have to remove the elevator assembly. Of course, the elevator assembly is pretty easy to get in and out of there, but sometimes it has to come out of there as well. But sometimes it'll just pull right out. It's a little bit of a choose your own adventure. And all the while we're doing this, we have to avoid bending that bottom tang. So very carefully here, keeping the gun supported, we'll begin pushing the magazine backwards. There we go. Once it gets to about here, I want to point out, gotta go forward a little bit, I want to point out this ring on the magazine. We'll talk more about what specifically it does as we're getting things put back together on this. However, this ring on the magazine has to sort of be clocked just right in order to get out of the rear receiver of the gun. The ring's got like a little lug on it, and that lug lines up with a little cut on the receiver that we'll look at here in a little bit. But for now, we'll move our magazine backwards, just as we've been doing. It's looking good. The magazine will need to kick over to the side, and just because, out of an abundance of caution, usually this work needs to be done. We'll get the magazine back about this far, and now we will remove the elevator assembly. The elevator assembly comes out pretty easily. We push the bolt release, lift the elevator up, and just wiggle it out to the side. And that snap you hear is the flat spring for the elevator assembly, which comes out there. This is relatively easy to put back in on reinstall, but we will leave it out for now to just give a little bit more room. I think that you're supposed to, maybe the intended way is you just force the magazine tube past that. However, I don't like forcing anything on this particular gun, what with it's kind of fragile. Go ahead. There we go. Get that ring rotated, and the magazine comes right out of the gun. And we're left with our receiver tank assembly. We can slide this cover panel off to expose the guts, like that's the mechanical computer guts that you're seeing there. A little bit complicated, and we'll sort of look at how this series of levers and arms actually work with each other to pull that off. But for now, that's our receiver. You may be wondering, how on earth do they manufacture some of these cuts? That was the thing that had always sort of boggled my mind, but after closer inspection, you'll see a little bit of discoloration there, and more obvious discoloration there, back there. This receiver was machined in 2/2 out of billet. Right, that's a big pocket to make out of billet. No stamping going on here. And then the 2 halves welded together. It's probably the most economical way to make this if you can't use stamping, and it's frankly really, really impressive to, the fact that that can be done, and there's a chance, right? There's at least some chance that it works correctly, is a very, very cool thing. But for now, we can set this down carefully so as to watch out for that ever so fragile tang, and we can look at our rear magazine assembly. It is kind of Count Dooku's lightsaber, right? That's the very obvious comment. You can see this one's been repaired, either repaired or modified, right? This lug has been had a little bit of brazing globbed onto it to hold it on a little better. A bottom lug down here. This is, I guess, a bent tube. I can't quite tell if this was two tubes that just had their joint welded. There's a little bit of pipe fitter going on there, or if it was one tube that was just bent around a mandrel. I'm not entirely sure which it was. Either way, it's a very impressive feat of engineering. And we have a cap here threaded on the end, right? This sort of takes a pin wrench to thread off. I've had it off before just to clean out inside of there. We have a follower down inside there as well. The follower has a little rubber foot that's deteriorating. I'll probably need to replace that with printed like a TPU pad at some point. But for now, even though deteriorating, it is still doing pretty well. The gun does still work. We have this ring here that I mentioned. This ring's normal position is over here on this side of the gun, and what it does is pretty interesting. We can get ourselves our handy hyper-realistic snap cap here, and what we'll see this ring do whenever we look at the rest of the gun, there's an arm in the gun that will raise and lower to spin this ring. Whenever the ring is in its lowered position there, this arm, sort of a separate piece of this tube, this arm is able to expand outwards. Because there's a spring pushing the shell, right, these arms are responsible for latching onto the rim of the shell. I can sort of demonstrate that here. As you push the round back in its current configuration, the shell is able to come past those fingers, both back and forward. In its other configuration, whenever the ring is up, the shell cannot come past those fingers. It'd either be locked from going back or locked from going forward. So if we rotate the ring into its unlocked position and attempt to put a shell in, we can, and then we can rotate this ring backwards to lock that shell in place. Now you may be asking, does this mean that you can then rotate the ring and shoot the shell out? And it's true, you can. Let's see if we can find a relatively safe way to do this. Maybe shoot it into our paper towel roll. Maybe shoot it into our paper towel roll here. We'll rotate it. Woo, it shoots the shell out. So that's your magazine system in a nutshell. Is in order to get the rear magazine to feed, it just has to be bumped to go boop boop, boop boop, and that just gets you one shell out. Boop boop, just like that. Just to show you that one more time. For loading, it needs to be rotated down. Of course, the follower does still like to hang up sometimes as it lurches forwards. Get the follower reset, push the shell back, lock the shell in place, and then rotating this ring this way will fire the shell out, just like that. And that's basically it for the rear magazine. It looks a lot more complicated than it is. Additionally, we have a little bit of a spring arm here that just acts as a detent, right? You've got this little protrusion on the ring that really just acts as a detent to sort of keep the ring from maybe bouncing under inertia, to click itself one way or the other. Except its actual position is there. So this is your locked position, this is your unlocked position, and this spring here is just there as sort of a detent as best I can figure. But there's that. We can set it to the side. And we are now on to our receiver. As I mentioned, we will not take this all the way apart because it is an absolute nightmare. However, what we can do is point out, of course, the trigger group is down there in the bottom. We have two triggers. We have our sear. All those sit on one pin. We have our safety back here, sort of a crossbolt design. And all it really does is prevent the sear from being able to rotate. Pretty simple. Then looking over here, we have a series of arms. Now, in order to better understand how these series of levers work together to accomplish the selective feeding and the crossover that this gun's mechanism is capable of, we've put a couple of pieces back onto the gun. Of course, we've got our stock back on, we've got our rear magazine tube reinserted because it's important to see how those parts go in there. However, as I'm describing some of these things, I'll need to talk about things that do require these pieces be missing, so I'll intersperse footage to sort of narrate what I'm talking about there. However, starting right off, we've got our arms, right? I don't have very clear scientific names for these arms. The patent literature tries to give them certain names, but the names are then a little bit confusing, so we'll just try and keep things pretty simple. We have an arm that's responsible for feeding from the front magazine. We have an arm that's responsible for feeding from the back magazine. We then have a series of arms and linkages that will connect those arms, the front arm and the rear arm, to what I would like to call the barrel slap arm. The barrel slap arm sticks up here in the receiver. It sort of has a one-way steer system where the barrel won't slap it whenever the barrel's coming backwards, but when it's coming forward, the sort of rail on the barrel will push down here, which in turn pushes this whole arm, sort of an L-shaped fellow, it pushes it down. When that arm is pushed down, it will impinge on, based on how the rest of the linkages are set, either the rear feed arm or the front feed arm. Now, underneath the magazine tube, we have a sort of toggle and over center mechanism is basically what it is, where depending on which trigger you pull, you'll either have the toggle, the over center mechanism in one of two places. We can see here through this window that over center mechanism get actuated by pulling one trigger at the other, where if the rear magazine is pulled, this over center mechanism has a peg that sits underneath the rear magazine feed arm. However, whenever the front trigger is pulled, that peg then switches over to be aligned with the front barrel feed arm linkage. So it's kind of easy to see then that your input, right, the thing that triggers the feeding event is the barrel coming forward and it hits this arm and slaps it downwards. And that would be just like this. This L-shaped arm gets pushed down. Now, whenever it gets pushed down, depending on which trigger was pulled, this over center mechanism is either pushing on the rear barrel feed arm or a linkage that then pushes on the front barrel feed arm. We'll use some shells in a moment to sort of mock up how that system works. However, I would first like to address how the cross-feed system works. Now, we've previously explained the rear trigger is not capable of pulling from the front magazine. The only way that the rear trigger does anything is whenever there's rounds in the rear magazine. However, the front trigger is capable of switching over to feed from the rear magazine whenever the front trigger, the front magazine is emptied, front trigger now feeds from the rear magazine. The way that this is accomplished is a sort of backup series of linkages where you have a finger here, which is pushed out of the way whenever the front magazine has shells, but whenever the front magazine is empty, it is in this state where it is not pushed out of the way. Now, this finger pushes on this linkage that pivots within the rear magazine feed arm, such that whenever you have a shell in the gun, this linkage is lined up with the rear magazine feed arm, and the rear magazine feed arm doesn't move whenever the front magazine feed arm is pushed. However, whenever there isn't a shell in the gun, you can see this linkage pushes in. Whenever it is pushed in, sort of in this declined state, the peak of it sits over the top of the front magazine feed arm linkage, such that whenever you then pull the front trigger, the over center mechanism will be sitting underneath the front magazine feed arm linkage. However, because the front magazine doesn't have any rounds, and this tab here, this finger, is now sitting over the top of that front magazine feed arm linkage, the front magazine feed arm linkage will now push up on the rear magazine feed arm, which will make the rear magazine feed off of a front trigger pull. In this way, it's actually a little bit less complicated and scary than it looks. However, sort of absent one of C and Arsenal and Bruno's animations, it may be a little tricky to fully understand exactly all that's going on here. So one more time, just to go over things, explaining it while we're trying to point out things and manipulate it with our hands before we go to dummy shells to demonstrate it. Whenever the front trigger is pulled, that over center mechanism is underneath the front magazine feed linkage. Depending on whether or not there is a shell in the magazine, the finger on the rear magazine feed arm may or may not be above the front magazine feed linkage. So if we say that there is a round in the magazine and push it to the side, whenever the barrel slap arm gets hit down, what it is going to do is push up on the linkage for the front magazine feed arm such that this gate here then moves down. So this gate here that actually holds the shells into the front magazine is the same as this arm. You can see it here through the window. So if we hold this tab over to simulate there being a shell in the magazine and push the barrel feed arm down, we'll see right there that the front magazine latch drops, and that would let a shell out of the front magazine. Okay, but let's say we have a shell in the front, no shells in the front magazine now, okay? No shells in the front magazine. Front trigger is still pulled. Now if we go to push on this arm, It will still try and lower that front feed gate. However, at the same time, it's trying to lift up the rear magazine feed arm as well. So there we have the rear magazine feed arm being engaged, even though the front trigger is pulled. Similarly, if we press the rear trigger, now that over-center mechanism is just sitting underneath the rear magazine feed arm there. And similarly, whenever the barrel comes and hits the feed arm, the rear magazine mechanism will be lifted. Now, just to give you guys a peek back here, that retaining ring that we'd pointed to earlier, whenever the barrel slap arm is hit, we can give you guys an idea of, there's that ring rotating right back there. That's what lets shells in and out of the rear magazine based off of the slap arm raising and lowering it. But that's the basics of this system. We'll go ahead and put some shells in there to sort of simulate it by pushing down here on this tab. But in order to do that, we will have to put the side plate back on, because as you push on this tab, it tries to push some of the levers out of the gun, and we don't want to accidentally cause anything to bind up as we're here sort of monkeying with the thing. But with 3 hyper-realistic snap caps here, we can go ahead and put one into the front magazine. Of course, kind of have to load it from the bottom whenever the elevator's in the gun. So we'll go ahead and put the one in the front magazine. Go ahead and put a second one in the front magazine. Go ahead and keep the carrier popped down, and now we'll see if we can stuff one into the rear magazine. And as you might expect, in order to get a round to go into the rear magazine, we have to push this button in order to get that ring to rotate. So of course, pushing this button lifts up on that rear magazine feed arm so that we can disable that ring to let the shell get past the fingers on it. But there we have the thing loaded. Now in order to simulate feeding, if we pull the front trigger, we've got rounds in the front magazine. Pushing down on this arm is what would begin to get us our feeding cycle. We might actually need to get ourselves a screwdriver or a punch to push down on that. So here with a punch, we can push down on this arm. And once it's pushed down all the way, of course, I held it down for too long there, so I'm going to get 2 shells out. But there was 1 shell from the front magazine that would have fed. However, if I pull the rear trigger, so now the rear feed mechanism is selected, and I push down on this arm, it will be stiffer because the springs involved are stiffer. But if I push down enough, there we go, a shell fed out of the rear magazine. Now, just to mock this up, if we take and make the front magazine completely empty, and then load 1 more shell into the rear magazine, which might be a little stiff here now, but go ahead and get that loaded up. All right, so now we have 1 round in the rear magazine, no rounds in the front. We're going to pull the front trigger just to show you guys that now the cross-feed mechanism will take over. As we push, we'll get that magazine to feed a shell out of the rear magazine off of that front trigger pull. And this is the basics of how this entire magazine system works. It's your series of levers. The important things to remember is really you've got 3 major components plus a series of linkages. The main components being the barrel slap arm. That's what gives you your input to feed something. Based on the position of the over-center mechanism that's located on the slap arm, and of course that over-center mechanism is set based off of whichever trigger you pull, but barrel slap arm has an over-center mechanism adjusted by which trigger is pulled. You then have 2 other things that are very important, a rear magazine feed arm and a front magazine feed arm. You have a linkage for the front magazine feed arm. You have a linkage that rides on the rear magazine feed arm. The linkage on the rear magazine feed arm enables it or disables it based on if there's rounds in the front magazine. The linkage for the front magazine feed arm just connects the barrel slap arm to the front magazine feed arm because, of course, we have our barrel feed arm gets pushed down, but then the feed gate for the front magazine also gets pushed down, so there just has to be a sort of an intermediary link in there to make it so you push down here, which is a push up here, results in a push down up here. So that's the extra linkage for the front magazine. Really the only complicated extra linkage is the one here on the rear feed arm, which really just waits for there to be a round in the front magazine or not, and then adjusts the gun's feeding accordingly. But hopefully that gives you guys a little bit better idea of how the feeding on this gun actually works. And with that said, we'll go ahead and send you guys back to the main part of the video, get this thing thrown back together to go and do a little bit of shooting with it. All right, and at this point, we're ready to begin putting the receiver back together. We will start with our magazine tube assembly here. What I've found works best is rotating the notch where the arm is going to interface with the magazine tube into the vertical position, then sliding it together. And of course, once we get this about halfway installed, we will need to install the elevator. We will wiggle it forward, and we need to watch out for this arm because it needs to be retaining the hammer. Things rotated like this. We missed the hammer there, so we got to wiggle it back out. There we go. That's looking pretty good. At this point, we can install the carrier. Make sure the tube is pulled back far enough for the carrier to wiggle its way into the gun, like so. Then we will leave the carrier in its upright position, being careful with everything back here, which is of course quite the balancing act. Get this tab inside of the hammer, and now what we will do with the gun upside down is take the carrier spring. It's going to go into its slot in the receiver, and then from above you can push the carrier spring down so that it springs the carrier, like so. Now the carrier is in how we want it to be. The magazine tube will go forward and down, and then this tab here is going to sit inside of this box, essentially the slot that the rear magazine tube arm goes into. We'll get lined up there, and as we're doing this, we then have to get that ring rotated around so that the arm can pick it up. Maybe a little bit further. And again, this is all 5 things have to happen in one assembly, and they all have to happen in a very particular order. So there we've got the arm is interacting with the ring. You can see when I push the button, the ring will rotate. So the button's installed. Make sure that the carrier's in there correctly. The carrier can come up, but it's not popping down all the way, which suggests that the carrier spring needs to be seated just a little bit better. I'll take a punch here and just tap it happily into its home. Like so. So now the carrier should be able to, pop down and click into place. And then pop back up. Alright, carrier's happy. Magazine tube is slotted into the slot over there, and we push its nose down so it latches in at the front, and then we're able to install our pins. I found that doing the smaller pins first works a little bit better. Pins. Looks good. And now for the large pin, I found that it inserts easier from this side. And this isn't meant to be a tapered pin, but this pin does have a little bit of distortion on one side, which makes it a little bit easier to install like this. There we go. I give it just 2 more taps to get it nice and flush. There we go. Maybe one more. There we go, not protruding on either side, which will make it easy for the stock to get over it, which is our next step. We will install the stock. It's just to screw up the buttstock, so I'll take it off the camera to make sure I don't ding anything up, because of course this is a rather fragile stock. So we'll take it off camera, get the stock installed, and then be right back. There's the stock reinstalled, and now we will finish up the stock installation by putting our butt plate back on with its 2 screws. This is all fairly typical back here, stuff we've seen before. And with our butt pad reinstalled, the screwdriver, we're now ready to get the front end of the gun reinstalled. Get this tube lined up just right with its witness mark. Now we can get our bolt group and its spring. What I found works best is if you separate this spring like so, have one spring in the guide on the bolt, the other spring in the guide, and this just sits into a divot in the back of the receiver. Nothing to properly retain it. Make sure you can feel that it's in the divot. Then we can put our bolt back in. We'll want to cock our hammer back just to keep it out of the way for a moment. Just like that. Now the springs are all fully compressed. Everything there looks good. So we can let the bolt forward to the position where it will just rest. Make sure that everything else in the gun looks good. We can hit our button just to make sure that the magazine assembly moves free without binding, and it does. That's what we want to see. And so now we will put our hat back on, line up its slots, like so, and then guide it backwards. I missed the front rails. These hats are pretty tricky to get on just right. There we go. There's the hat. Now we'll pull the bolt back, reinstall the barrel assembly. Apologies if I don't get this shown to the camera perfectly, but because this gun's spring is longer than its magazine tube, this is a very haphazard process. Push it on like that, and then you've got to hold the rings against the force of the spring. Guide the barrel on carefully. Might have to switch up which hand I'm doing what with. Tricky to show to a camera too. Get the barrel on so it can hold the rings, then grab all the way out on the barrel, pull it back enough to get the handguard on, line the pin with the handguard pins up with the top cover and receiver holes, and finally we can spin this screw on. There it is. It's as tight as this one wants to be. Give the barrel a rack, and you can hear that extra click as it comes forward, and that's that little flappy arm getting flip-flapped, flip-flapped, flip-flapped. And I'd like to put the gun together to show you guys, really it'd be cool to see the internals with the panel off whenever it's shooting. The problem is as I mentioned, those get side-loaded, and especially whenever it's shot, it just tries to crap those guts out the side. Maybe eventually what I need to do is get a little dovetailed Lexan window to put there, just so you'd be able to see the, of course it's really simple, right? The barrel slap arm just goes dut, and that either lowers the magazine in the front, or along that arm, it makes it go ch-ch-ch-ch-ch. It's all a really simple system, just looks very complicated. But with everything back together, we can do our usual function tests. We'll just dry fire it once to check. Off of the rear trigger here, might as well. Safety's on. We know the safety works. Go ahead and rack the bolt, send it home, and feel for reset. Let it forward slow. There we go. Oh, and a little bit of slack there in the trigger, just on the reset. And there we have it. That's the Breda Automatic, right? The first in the line of the Breda Autos. We will go ahead and do a little bit of shooting with it, shoot a couple of targets, get some slow-mo footage mixed in there because it is really cool in slow motion to see the selection between the triggers. And of course, in the shooting segment, we will talk in more detail about the actual manual of arms. It's kind of funky, but once we're done with that, talk about manual of arms, talk about shooting, we'll come back here to the table for some final thoughts and then go on our way.
We're out here with the Breda Prola to do a little bit of clay shooting. Now, of course, as usual, we're shooting targets that are pretty close, pretty easy shots so that you guys can see the targets better, because of course, harder targets way out there become very difficult to see. Now, jumping right into things, loading the front magazine on the Breda Prola is a lot like we're used to from other automatic shotguns. We have one in the chamber, two in the front magazine, Loading the rear magazine will involve pressing this button on the bottom of the gun, which just rotates that ring with the fingers on it out of the way, like we showed during the disassembly step. And this button can sometimes be a little funky with getting the shells back just right in line with the tube. But once you've done it, you now have 5 rounds loaded up. At this point, the front trigger pulls from the front magazine, the rear trigger pulls from the rear magazine. The front trigger will pull from the rear magazine when the front magazine is empty, but the rear trigger can only pull from the rear magazine. Well, all the loads we're using today are standard target loads, just some of them are red shells and some of them are orange shells. Let's pretend that we were waterfowl hunting and we were interested in shooting ducks and geese. Now, you can kill ducks with goose shot, but it's really hard to kill geese with duck shot, and it's usually not even worth shooting at them whenever you've just got duck shot loaded up. However, with the Breda Prola, the way that you could load your gun up is to put your duck loads in the front, your goose loads in the back, and then whichever shell in the chamber that you think you're more likely to be shooting at, so your ducks or your geese. That way, if you ever have a duck come over, you can just keep pulling that front trigger and you'll get duck, duck, duck. You're rounding the chamber plus 2 duck loads, and then it will switch to feeding goose loads. However, if a goose comes over, you just go for the rear trigger because it's not even worth shooting your duck loads at them. And this way it will lock open whenever you've expended all your goose loads. And while yes, ultimately the complexity that has to go on here in this gun and the cost of this gun make it so that you could just have 2 guns, one loaded with duck loads, one loaded with goose loads, and just pick up the one that you were planning on shooting at whatever's coming your way. The mechanical ingenuity that has to go on to make this system work in that way is truly impressive. But with that yammering out of the way, we can go ahead and shoot the thing. Now, my initial comments on the handling of the thing is it is actually extremely well balanced. It has that good friction ring system that makes it so it's a pretty darn smooth shooter. However, this stock has way too much drop for my face, and so my face, I end up having to float my cheek off the stock to be able to see down the top of the gun. So it's not a very easy gun for me to shoot, but all things considered, it's really not a bad shooter considering the interesting thing about this gun is not how it shoots so much as how it works. Let's go ahead and shoot these 5 rounds through it, and then we can switch to doing a little bit of slow-mo to hopefully better see maybe a little bit on the inside, the internal mechanism at play. As we're shooting these 5 shells, we'll sort of pretend that there's different sort of water birds that we're shooting at. For these first 3 shots, let's pretend they're geese. So we'd pull on the rear trigger so as to not have to bother with our front duck loads at all. There we go, that would be 1 smoked goose. Another smoked goose. Those goose flying straight away from us sure are polite. Anyway, at this point the gun is locked open, but we still have our duck loads there in the front. Because as explained, ordinarily you wouldn't want to waste your duck loads shooting them at geese because it might not even penetrate their feathers, depending on the range and time of season. Now, with your gun in this state, after we've just shot the geese, let's say, oh no, there's a pack of ducks coming. Now, you could manually remove 1 round from the magazine if you wanted, or just plop an extra round into the chamber, and now our front trigger will fire off of the front magazine. So let's say here come our 3 ducks. And like that, the gun will lock open off of the front trigger. Now, if at any point in those 3 rounds we had pulled the rear trigger instead, the gun would lock open after that shot, because the rear trigger locks open if there's no more rounds in the rear mag. Now, with our pretend waterfowling out of the way, let's pop the top cover off of this thing, load it up the same way, 1 red shell in the chamber, 2 red shells in the front, 2 orange shells in the back, and then do a little bit of slow-mo, alternating between the triggers, to hopefully give you guys just an idea of how the gun's mechanism actually cycles as the thing is being fired. So there we have it. That is the Breda Prola. A very interesting, even fascinating mechanical execution of an idea that maybe has some merit. It's just that by the time you've got this, you could have two guns, and two guns is probably the better option to just having one of these. However, there is something to be said for the passion and the interest that went into making something like this work in the first place, and I'm very glad that something like this exists. Now, instead of going back inside for our closing thoughts, I think we can just about wrap it up here. Now, while this gun isn't technically a prototype because it did see serial production and it was intended to be sold to people as the design was, it did sort of have that weird falling out with a business arrangement that prevented it from seeing very large production numbers at all. So it's difficult to sort of compare and contrast this to a lot of things because, frankly, there could have been improvements all over the place in this design. However, the way that it is, the way that we ended up getting it without any improvements, is shockingly, bewilderingly good for something that was, you know, it was a gun that had a design without any real room for improvement that was sort of put into production in about the span of a year. It's frankly amazing that it works as well as it does. Now, of course, it does have quirks, right? These guns do have parts in them that are prone to break. They don't always fit together perfectly. This one's got a replacement firing pin, for example. So these guns are not by any means invincible or perfect. The fact that the mechanism, though, works at all is pretty darn cool. Now, we said at the beginning that in future videos we'll be taking a look at this gun's descendants. Now, none of its descendants are as mechanically interesting as what we have going on here because they just have one trigger and one magazine tube. However, this gun's descendants ends up leading to what I consider to be the greatest shotgun ever designed. And I'll explain more about why I feel that way in the videos for those guns that sort of came after this thing. But I think that the sort of closing thought on this gun is that if this was where the lineage ended, I probably would not feel very fondly about this gun, right? I do have to sort of address the fact that I feel very nicely about this gun because the guns that it sort of spawned off are fantastic. They're wonderful guns. This thing's not really fantastic. It's not a wonderful gun. It does work. This example works well. I've talked to other people. I've handled another example. They did not nearly work as well as this thing. And even still, the rear magazine in this one is sort of kludgy. It sometimes light strikes, although that's probably just our replacement firing pin doing replacement firing pin things. All that to say that this gun's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. And I sort of look at it with rose-tinted glasses because its descendants are fantastic and they are amazing. And they're just some of the best shotguns ever made, if not the best shotguns ever made. So I'll leave you guys with that thought that this is not the last chapter in this story. They end up making a better version of this, which is much simpler and awesome. We'll take a look at that in future videos. But until then, I am overjoyed that I've been able to share with you guys this fantastically funky shotgun with a mechanical computer slapped onto the side of it so that you could maybe arguably, possibly hunt ducks and geese at the same time, maybe a little bit better. And those are the thoughts I wish to leave you guys with for now. If you enjoyed this video or videos like this or videos not like this, because we do a lot of those on the channel as well, I would appreciate it if you guys would check out my Patreon. It's linked there between the video and the sort of comment section. Any support on the Patreon helps me make more videos like these and helps fuel me to be able to do the research and the deep dives on guns like this. This is a gun I found out about on accident trying to find out about other Italian guns and then sort of bumped into this gun and then one thing led to another and now we're able to make a video with it. So it's you guys that give me the fuel and the drive to be able to continue doing that. If not financially, of course, you can just leave a comment or a like. You can let me know which is the best shotgun with 2 triggers and 2 magazine tubes that accomplishes feed between the 2 of them with a mechanical computer. You can let me know what you guys' favorite is. Weirdly, there's another one. There is a second one. It was a prototype only sort of thing though, and it didn't have the crossover from one magazine to another. So it's not quite a mechanical computer because it doesn't have that, you know, data store, if you will. So there is one of those guns. If I can ever get my hands on one, I'd love to bring you guys a video, but there was like 10 of those made and they're all very prototype, and the things I've read and heard is they don't work at all. But perhaps something to look forward to in the future. Anyway, I appreciate it, you guys. I hope you guys have enjoyed the look at the coolest 2 magazine, 2 trigger, accomplishing that feeding crossover by means of a mechanical computer shotgun that maybe ever existed. See you next time.